Some graphics cards are such bad value that they seem like scams, and some are from brands so unknown they might as well be. But it's always unique when a company like Nvidia releases a card so mysterious and misleading that people on the internet argue to this day whether it actually exists. Now, this right here is the Nvidia GeForce MX4000, an elusive card that no one seems to talk about because those that had one are still scarred from owning it, and those that didn't have one didn't have the misfortune of knowing it even existed. But I've managed to grab one, more or less brand new in box, and let me tell you that this thing may be the height of misleading cards, to the stage that people that did buy them went online to tell people that they felt scammed by such a large company. Now, inside the box, what you do get is a manual that tells you more or less nothing, a really small and depressing looking graphics card, and also a driver CD. You do also get a really mediocre looking composite cable, and really, that is about it. What matters more, though, is the box. Imagine seeing this thing up on the shelf in 2005. It must have seemed amazing, with its lies scattered all over the place, everything from amazing new DirectX support, which, not spoiling anything here, that's a lie, it can't do that, and it has a big claim saying 256-bit GPU core, whatever that nonsense means, because there's a big sticker next to it saying 32-bit on the box as well. The card really cannot make up its mind over what it actually is, but hey, it's Nvidia, it's the way it's meant to be played, so why don't we whack this into a test system and find out what is the MX4000 and why is this thing such an awful and genuinely terrible release? And is that even the truth? Now, while we're getting this thing all set up, just what is the MX4000 and why have you never heard of it? Well, my journey into this card started with a forum thread arguing over whether or not this card existed back in 2004, with most people saying there is no such thing. But a small group of people had gone to the shops and spent about £50 to £60 on their new graphics card, under the promise that they were getting some real gaming performance, while those in the forum mostly compared this thing to an old boot, a shoe, or some people even comparing it to a slice of bread. So this card wasn't really new. The MX4000 was released in late 2003 and lasted till around mid-2006. But this is not a 2003 card. No, not by any means. This is in fact a GeForce 4 MX series where they added some very poorly implemented modern features, claimed it was new, and then re-released it to the market, with production becoming most mainstream in around 2004 and peaking in 2005. Now, the MX series, for those that don't know, was regarded as one of the worst releases in graphics card history. I mean, even at the early days of this channel, I covered an MX series card, and at the time, it was the worst card you could still buy new. They were still selling those cards new in 2016, 2017, but it's such a strange release and is often regarded as one of the worst releases, with them actually being GeForce 2 cards with a new name, and then heavily advertised as the next generation. Now, back in 2002, they weren't the worst thing in the world. I mean, they nearly were, but the fact they got a hidden re-release along what would have been the GeForce 5000 series, the 6000 series, and I found these things on sale with even the 7000 series. At that point, essentially being a 90s architecture, still sold for a relatively high price point in the mid-2000s. Thing is, even on Nvidia's website just after its launch, it never actually got a web page. This card is a real thing that exists and was confirmed by their product lineup report, but it's dumped in with the GeForce 200 and 400 lineup. Thing is though, it gets worse from here. People were understandably not happy with most of these retailing for rather high prices, with pushy salesmen generally managing to trick those less computer savvy into buying them. I mean, half the box is filled with nonsense buzzwords, a lot of graphics cards back then were, but these are just outright lies. Thing is though, as bad as the MX400 series was, these cards are even worse. They are crippled by an awful 32-bit memory bus, meaning you would be seeing worse performance than most MX series cards and the original GeForce 2 series cards, and every other feature on this has been cut down. I didn't think you could possibly cripple a card more than the FX5200 series and things like that this was directly rivaling. This came out after the 5000 series was already onto the market, but it managed to. Fortunately, towards the end of the mid-2000s, these things faded into obscurity, long since letting people forget that they ever made them. Until now, when we can relish in the fact that yes, the MX4000 series is real, and we are going to finally find out just how bad it really is. And is it the scam that everyone seemed to call it from back in the day? Specifications-wise, the MX4000 is painfully bad. It is cut down on the same architecture as the GeForce 256 series, which is what people call the original graphics card, but it finds itself woefully cut down. It does have big buzzwords on the box like 64MB of DDR RAM, which it does in fact have, but this is crippled down by a shockingly small 32-bit memory bus, so how that RAM can even be used, it's beyond me, I don't know. It has 2 whole pixel shaders, that's right, 2, 4 TMUs, 2 ROPs, and technically, and this is the big selling point here, supports DirectX 8.1. Really, it's only got support for DirectX 7, but it just sort of makes up the rest. There are no vertex shaders, nothing like that, and our card has room for a fan, but they've not bothered to add one. There are really very few things redeeming this card, it's just they took a card from 6 years prior, and then cut it down more, beat it with a stick presumably to give it more features, and then stuck it in a box for sale. It really is abysmal, and GPU-Z crashes before I can even get it open, so I don't even know what's happening there. The main redeeming thing is towards 2006 these things did become ludicrously cheap, with some people being able to grab them for about $15 and about the same in pounds, as they just wanted rid of them. You have the GeForce 8000 series coming up, which I don't want to say it revolutionized the low end with the 8400 GS, but, you know, it's better than this. So how awful really is this thing? In a sort of half-positive note, the card does actually come with some up-to-date drivers from around the end of 2005, which is at least nice, but also shows you that someone was buying this near on into the region of DirectX 10's launch, because that would come a year later, so that's not great. And with how quick things were progressing in tech around then, and the widely expanding options in the budget range, the only real incentive to buy this card was the Nvidia name. It's also probably well worth mentioning that they were being a tad optimistic with the software bundled in with this card, as it includes 3D Mark 2005, which I did actually try and launch, and you know what, I was really impressed, because the audacity of this, the card can't actually launch 3D Mark 2005, so it's a bold move to include a benchmark with your card, knowing full well that technologically it's so far behind, probably about 6 years behind, that it can't actually run it, which is impressive. You know, you're including software to be like, how great is your brand new graphics card? Find out. Just to be told you can't actually launch it, which is showing you this thing is competing with a literal turd. Really though, there is very little else to say about the card. It was overpriced for most people on its launch, neglected by Nvidia to the stage they don't list it on their own website, and mostly pushed onto people by salesmen. Still, it's real, it's here, and we have it, all ready to go. So why don't we find out? Was the Nvidia MX4000, as bad as people said it was, in the benchmarks? Starting off our benchmarks, we have Half-Life 2, which I'm going to say already is sort of the thing that this card runs best. See, it uses some trickery here to get the game to run in DirectX 7 mode, which is a bit strange. I thought we bought a brand new DirectX 8.1 graphics card. So it sort of does some tricks here, which with the lowest settings in 640 by 480, and I really do mean the lowest setting selected, we were just about able to see some okay performance. However, it was this trickery that meant that this card actually outperformed some of its competition, making it look better in benchmarks. Despite the fact it's actually using some tricks, it does run well. I mean, we saw anywhere between 30 to 60 FPS with it dropping down to the mid-20s when lots was going on, but I will warn you now, it is only downhill from here. This benchmark goes out to that one guy on the forums who bought this card to play Splinter Cell, which asked for a reasonable GeForce 2 to be able to run, so I would struggle on the GeForce MX4000. I mean, that came out years after those cards, and it has a bigger number. Well, that 32-bit memory bus brings things to a crawl. The game is absolutely hideous looking. Genuinely, I didn't think Splinter Cell could look this bad, or run this bad either. For a game that focuses so much on hiding in the shadows, I'm not too sure I can even tell what is a shadow. And the pixelization felt relentless. 640 by 480 can be rough, but generally it's not the worst. But here, well, it looks pretty similar to Minecraft in places. So Splinter Cell, that's a no-go. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic would run at around 5 FPS in the menus, which didn't lead to me thinking we were off to a good start, but things got better, and worse from here, with the game managing an appalling 15 FPS a lot of the time. This was of course with the absolute minimal settings in use, and during combat, the game was competitive with Microsoft PowerPoint, reminding you that this really is the way games are meant to be played. I know the cutscenes in this game can be comical at times, but this was almost funny watching them play out in what seemed like slow motion in the most anticlimactic manner possible. So yeah, those DirectX 8 optimizations this card has, I'm not seeing any so far. Command & Conquer Generals reminds you that this was a budget card, and was competitive with the 3D Phantom Scam graphics card we looked at a few weeks ago, with cutscenes being almost unbearably slow. Now I remember playing this on an Intel Extreme Graphics 2 chip, I'm fairly sure, and here I'm fairly sure that the MX4000 is losing to that chip. I know there can be a lot going on at times, and the game asks for a GeForce 2 once again, but it's no surprise that here, years on from that card's release, that this weird MX card can't actually manage the game, which is shocking really. Star Wars Battlefront is an interesting one, as it shows exactly what this card was meant to do. See the GeForce MX400 series that came before, this game knows that they are unsupported, and it says so in the manual and at the game's online test feature. But this card isn't mentioned. Very few games actually do mention this card, and when they do, they show up like they did here in Battlefront, where it scans your system and says you can run this, when in reality what that means is the game will launch and then call on a feature it doesn't have, and you get a black screen, occasionally with a fancy mouse cursor. You can't see menus, you can't really do anything, but because the card has a new name, this qualifies as compatible. Morrowind did run surprisingly okay with the lowest settings in a low resolution, and with a draw distance also so low you might as well just assume you're playing in a cloud. But even when in combat, the card did manage perfectly playable frame rates. Towns and cities would swamp the memory bus and drop it to the mid-20s, but even then it was playable just about, and never enough to make things slow down too much. Which is something. You've got to take your wins when you can, so at least Morrowind here was playable. It's just a shame that it's not looking all too great while it runs. Unreal 3 was a reason that a lot of people decided to pick up this card just to be able to play the game. And a lot of that was mentioned on forums back in the day with people downloading the demos and finding the performance here was genuinely dire. The card was so crisp games it does support. The performance we saw here was on par with that 3D Phantom once again, which is never something you ever want to hear me say. Was playable, just, and in 240p you could hit around 50 to 60 FPS, but in the more recent 640 by 40 by T, you were looking at anywhere between 20 to 40, which isn't too bad. But the image quality here looked like it suffered a lot, and I don't know if you can tell, but there's something that seems off the output here, and I'm not too sure what's causing it, as it was the same when displayed on a CRT. So the performance here is just about playable, albeit not competitive, so there is... Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, I realised, was a big one for Nvidia, and they were touting compatibility back in the day, saying you needed a GeForce card for what they were calling the upcoming Oddworld 3. And you know what? They certainly achieved something. as I've never seen something run so badly or strangely before. This was the original port from the Windows XP era, and well, the game sort of runs at well over 100 FPS. It just displays nothing, and then starts glitching out before you can even exit. If you ran it in windowed mode, you could see weird green bars coming out of where there once was text, and that was just strain. GTA Vice City didn't run. I mean, I wasn't expecting it to, but the game would crash out and leave you with a fun window to play around with, which is probably more fun than how the game would run if you could get it to launch. I think this game actually asks for DirectX 9, so it's sort of understandable it's not running here, but it's from when this graphics card came out, and a lot of the low-end competition can at least launch the game. So it's a bit confusing that it can't run here. I mean, it's not confusing, it makes sense from a feature set perspective, but it's just not good. I can't argue with this. Half-Life 1 ran really well in OpenGL mode, which I suppose is one of the card's strengths for older titles. You can get okay performance with OpenGL, but I can't tell if there's something going on with the display again, as the output just seemed weird. There were these wavy lines across the screen in places which doesn't happen with DirectX, which had its own set of issues that made it more or less unplayable. It's a documented problem with these cards, and it looks better, but it introduces so much latency that you could move the mouse, come back in an hour, and it might have registered the input. There's no reason why it does this, as I've tried different drivers, and it just seems like that's a problem with these cards and DirectX in Half-Life 1. So, weird problems, but OpenGL does tend to run the game fine in a relatively nice 1024x768 resolution. But can it run Crysis? Well, no. It might lie about some features, but it doesn't lie enough to make it actually be able to run Crysis. It does detect it as a card, and makes the PC panic and run in a funky 256 colour mode, which looked kinda nice, but that's about all the card can do with Crysis. It's no surprise it can't run here, but I always have to try it just in case. So those are the benchmarks. And honestly, some people are going to say I'm being unfair. Why am I not testing more 90s titles? Well, I'm testing the card with games that came out from when the card came out, and the years before. And it does run 90s titles okay, it just doesn't do particularly well. I mean, Unreal Gold can manage medium-ish settings at around 30 to 60 FPS, which is dire, and the same goes for Quake 3. It runs, and it runs pretty badly. I mean, this is a cut-down GeForce 2 card. It was never going to run those games well, and the 90s games, well, even those can struggle. The 2D performance is relatively decent and the output's quite clear. It's not Matrox level, but being based on the technology it is, well, it's old enough that it was never going to be. It's just this era in the mid-2000s is when the budget market got really competitive and quite interesting, and I cannot comprehend how this thing, one, managed to get released, and two, how it managed to linger on for so long. Just when people thought the MX series was done for, this one snuck through the cracks with the worst performance of the bunch, and lasted the longest, which is so strange. I don't even really know where to place this card, as I mean its competition would be things like the 3D Phantom XP weird graphics card thing, the Radeon 9200 series, and some of the Matrox cards that were going down in price. Its own competition is also the Nvidia FX series. It makes no sense to have this card on the market. Maybe there were just spare chips left lying around, but these things are so cut down. It's awful. That's not something that really makes sense. I just don't get it. They had the FX5200 based on a similar architecture. So why would you release this? I mean, the card was hated enough, but this one is just worse in every way. I mean, yes, some games does trick into running okay. I mean, the Half-Life 2 performance is brilliant for the card. I've just realised it's actually not brilliant performance, it's pretty bad. It's not even a good display adapter, it's only okay, and you're paying an awful lot for performance that is ultimately terrible. The 32-bit memory bus makes no sense and means that you're limited to minuscule resolutions even in older games. I mean, Unreal struggles in 1024x768, and that is not a hard game to run for something from the mid-2000s. It's just mind-boggling. How does this exist? How did it cost so much? And how did it manage to last for so long? I can't even see a use case for people wanting a cheap retro card. The only redeeming factor are the drivers, which are pretty good. You can't use most of the features because the card can't manage it, and I guess it's compatible with most PCs, which can be a problem on some older systems. Just get something else though, just anything. I bought this purely because I wondered if it was real after seeing those forum posts. And now I wish I hadn't, because it's just bad. It's genuinely terrible at everything. It's not terrible enough to be funny. It's just bad. I can't get over how bad this thing is, and the fact it was on the market for so long. It's terrible. Awful. Terrible, terrible, awful thing. So there we have it. The Nvidia GeForce MX4000. And it's real, but is it a scam? I mean, kinda. It lies heavily on the marketing, especially the feature support, and Nvidia didn't want to acknowledge its existence beyond a product specifications page. Most reviews are long since gone from the modern web, and even today, people on forums, well, they can be found arguing over whether it's real or not. I mean, we know it is real, and to some people that might seem common knowledge, but I can understand the questioning. When something is this bad and all you've seen is that it's cut down from a 6-year-old architecture, you've never seen one for sale, how can you be certain it ever existed? But now that's all answered. Now this video was a bit of fun to make, as the original plans for this video were for a relatively huge graphics card story about a card that Nvidia wanted to bury a little bit. You know, there's some confidential documents out there, it's quite interesting, and that video is still in the works, it just needs a little bit more time. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed watching this video instead, on what is genuinely a terrible graphics card. It's been fun, I guess. I hope you all enjoyed watching, and good night.
Now this is what I call performance. What is it says on the box? The way it's meant to be played.